very moment, Wilson is hearing from his advisors, Charles Crane, McCormick, and John Armand. What does John Armand say to him? He encourages Wilson to have his faith that he's doing the right thing and intervening in the Russian Civil War, and tells Wilson, you are providentially guided in showing your sympathy for the dark people groping after larger light and liberty. So even Mott invokes that idea of the dark people, the Jomira Narod, in July of 1918. So this is kind of subtle, trying to think about race and religion. This is not something that you write a policy document on and you spell it out the way that these kinds of assumptions influence your policy making, but I think it's important to have these things in mind. Now, so we talked about race, talked a little bit about religion. Now let's talk about politics. One of the questions that Christian and Tracy distributed asked you to think about, where do you put Wilson on the political spectrum? Over here on the board, you've got the political spectrum on the Russian side. Octobrists and social revolutionaries and social democrats. Where do you put Wilson on the political spectrum inside the United States? Well, you were asked to read, weren't you, N. Gordon Levin's book, Woodrow Wilson and World Politics. What does Levin say? Where does Levin put Wilson in terms of the political spectrum? Liberal internationalist, that would be a sort of synonym for Wilsonianism, liberal internationalism. Internationalism because isolationism is no longer possible. Our commerce is all around the world, and we are deeply connected to Europe financially, commercially, and that's been dramatized in the First World War when our economy boomed thanks to the fact that the European powers are warring. Lots of their soldiers are fighting instead of growing crops, so our economy boomed with shipments of bacon and flour across the Atlantic. We benefited from that. So we cannot be isolationists. We are internationalists. Yes, Gene?
Well, I was just going to say he evolved from, he was elected on the platform that he would keep us out of the war. So he began as in the eyes of the public as an isolationist, and it just kind of evolved. And I'm wondering if, seeing what he saw, what happened in the war, and dealing with his philosophy about paternalism and his kind of evangelistic tendencies, led him to change to more of less of a progressive isolationist and more as a liberal conservative. And I'm wondering too, at this time, if he wasn't racked with physical problems like severe headaches.
More and more by 1919.
Right.
But I think your point about isolationism at the outset is appropriate. So remember, First World War starts, the Great War in Europe starts in the summer of 1914, July, August 1914. Wilson's line then is, we're going to stay out. Why are we going to stay out? In part because we have German Americans inside the United States who sympathize with the Germans, and we have Russian Americans inside the United States who sympathize with the Russians. We have a lot of Anglo-Americans who sympathize. So our country is divided. I cannot take a united America into the war in Europe. So, and you're right. In 1916, one of his election slogans is he kept us out of war. 1916, but very soon after being reelected in November 1916, he's thinking about the prospects for intervention. Well, let's come to that in a moment. I think it is important to take that up in the context of how his religious views influence his sense to fulfill his personal mission and to fulfill America's personal mission. We have to get into the war. But let's come to that in a moment. Let's finish talking first about how you place Wilson politically. Levin's central argument, it seems to me, is that Wilson is in the center, the liberal center. And he's trying to find a path between atavistic imperialism on the right, and radical socialism on the left. Trying to steer a middle course. Well, let's keep that in mind as we move on to take on other points of view. One of the more influential books about Wilson and his foreign policy is by Thomas Knock, who was a Princeton University student, studied under the great Wilson scholar Arthur Leahy. And he wants to place Wilson not just in the center, but in the left of the center. and to say that this era, the first 2 decades of the 20th century in the United States, are an age of socialistic inquiry. This is the era when the New Republic magazine is promoting ideas about American reform that mean taking America in a socialistic direction. This is an era when many Christians did not think that Christianity and socialism were incompatible. In fact, many ministers in the United States were oriented towards a sort of form of Christianity and socialism. In fact, Wilson himself said that in theory, in principle, Christianity and socialism have the same ends. So Knox says, well, Wilson is consistently on the left, and this fits part of Knox's perspective to say Wilson was not hostile to the Russian revolutions. Wilson actually sympathized with the Russian revolutions. Let's go to the next slide. Yes?
So, as we're talking about Wilson and his liberalism, are we talking about a classical liberalism, or are we talking about a more modern vision of liberalism? It seems to me we're kind of stepping over that line at this point in time, not just in the classical liberalism view of enlightenment and all of those things, but into this more modern view of liberalism as actual social action that brings about a betterment of people through liberalism.
Yeah, so he runs in 1912 pretty much as a classic liberal, doesn't he?
Yeah.
A new freedom is his. So we want to preserve middle class independence, individualism at a time of large businesses and big labor.
And education.
But then what happens in Wilson's first administration? Federal Reserve Act, income tax, the legislation pushed through Congress is moving the United States towards having a government that is a liberal interventionist government managing the economy. So he runs in 1912, I would say, pretty much as a classic liberal, for free trade and so on, but then moves in a direction, and this is where Knock, I think, has a point, that this is an age of socialistic inquiry, and a lot of people are promoting these ideas, and they do come to influence the Woodrow Wilson administration. But I think there's another side that Thomas Knock forgets about, and this is something that I tried to argue in my first book. I think it's important to remember that one of Wilson's most strongest influences on this political thinking was the British writer Edmund Burke, who wrote about the French Revolution. And he liked to comment on Burke. He pressed forward with the most ardent in all plans of just reform, but he held back with the most conservative from all propositions of radical change. And it's in that context that you can understand that Wilson could say, yes, in theory, socialism and Christianity are the same in terms of their ultimate objectives, but in method, they're opposite. And therefore, we would reject socialism as we would reject the most vile poison, because its methods are coercive and state-centered and opposite to the Christian methods, which start from the individual and spirit and heart and so on. So I think Thomas Knox forgets that about Woodrow Wilson. I think that's important because this sort of idea that Wilson could push forward with most ardent proponents of just reform, but would pull back in horror from radical socialist revolution, helps to explain, I think, why Wilson would have passionate sympathy for what he understood as a just political revolution, the February Revolution in Russia, and would be horrified by the October Revolution that brings in the Bolsheviks, and would then go on to condone his Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, rounding up Reds inside the United States and putting them on ships and shipping them out of the United States, and putting many hundreds of others in jail, and for authorizing his Attorney General before to break up the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, in 1917. All of that Wilson completely accepts. So placing Woodrow Wilson as being consistently on the left and sympathetic to socialism, as Thomas Knox does not allow you to understand why Wilson drifts to the right at a time when he says the spirit of the Bolsheviki is lurking everywhere. That Bolshevism is not just a problem in Russia, but that we have lots of Bolshevik sympathizers inside the United States. He has Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, who got up and said, I am a Bolshevik from the top of my head to the tip of my toes. He's a Bolshevik in terms of what he believes that Bolshevism means in Russia. Actually, it means something different from what Christian socialism in the United States, but nonetheless, Debs says that, And Debs's anti-war position leads him to be imprisoned. And Woodrow Wilson refuses to pardon him, even at the end of his administration. So you can't understand that if you say with Thomas Knox, Woodrow Wilson is on the left of the political spectrum, consistently on the left, and is not horrified by the prospect of radical social revolution.
Before we did this, I haven't read Knox's book, but I'm wondering about your viewpoint on this. Do you think Wilson's ties with the eugenics movement of the time had anything to do with his belief that basically you're born a Bolshevik, there's something in your DNA, in your genetics that is going to cause you to never be able to accept other ideas, and therefore not allowing you without generations to go along to actually have self-determination?
I've never seen the evidence that eugenics would influence his thinking about Bolsheviks. I think he understood Bolsheviks in a couple of ways that we'll come to. I think he understood them as aliens, not authentically Russian. As we'll see later, German agents, conspirators with the Germans, and deluded radical ideologues who are also alien from the true spirit of the Russian people. But we'll come to that in a couple of slides. Okay, so race, religion, politics. Now I want to talk briefly with you about Wilson and Mexico. Why? A very different country, very different situation. But I think what we can see from looking at this is that actually what happens in Wilsonian responses to the Russian revolutions and Civil War is not unprecedented. That in fact, the way that Wilson responds to the Mexican Revolution is very much the same, or very much along the same line as you will with regard to Russia. Now, when Wilson first comes into power, he's campaigned on the idea of being against the big special interests, against Wall Street, and so one of the initial slogans is that he will depart from the dollar diplomacy of Taft, his predecessor in the White House, and that would be particularly applicable to his Latin American policy. So here you see the New York World, with Frank Cobb as the editor being very close to Woodrow Wilson. So anytime we look at the New York World editorials or the New York World political cartoons, it's really like a mouthpiece for the Woodrow Wilson administration. A Democratic paper, very sympathetic for Woodrow Wilson. Here's Woodrow Wilson throwing out the cash register of dollar diplomacy. Therefore, our diplomacy is no longer going to be driven by the interests of American big business, as Wilson is suggesting it was under Taft. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to depart from not just the precedent of Taft, but also from the precedent of Theodore Roosevelt. So here's Woodrow Wilson patting Miss Columbia on the head, because we need to apologize to Miss Columbia for taking Panama. Such an unchivalrous thing to do.
Well, we just gave her bags of money in the return.
That's right. We'll pay an indemnity to Apollo. And Theodore Roosevelt is irate.
Yes, I'm sure.
We didn't do anything wrong. Our conduct is always entirely moral and just. Those Colombian jackrabbits were trying to extort more money from us, so by God, we went ahead and built the Panama Canal. So you can see the sort of expectation that Wilson will be quite different from the interventionist policies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. But what actually happens? Actually, there's a pretty widespread assumption in the United States, whether you are a Wilsonian Democrat or you are a Theodore Roosevelt Republican, that it is the proper role of the United States to apply discipline in the Western Hemisphere. So, on your left, from the time of the Taft administration's intervention in Nicaragua, we've got to take that little misbehaving boy out to the Monroe Doctrine woodshed and apply a little physical discipline, and then a Constitution, Democratic paper, sympathetic to Woodrow Wilson, also suggesting that Wilson ought to use the sticks of the Navy and Army to take misbehaving Mexico off to the woodshed and apply. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that you can do, I think, with political cartoons in the classroom is to show the pervasiveness of underlying assumptions, things that might not be conveyed explicitly in words if you read a newspaper editorial, but that are there in the pictorial representation. And here what we find that the assumption is paternalism. Wilson did put this in words. We are adults in these great matters.